Rosie, it's great to have a chance to chat to you about anxiety, because I think you and I have both noticed recently that there is a lot of anxiety around. And would you say that, particularly in the last year or so, more people have become more anxious?
I think definitely. I mean, it's always been there, hasn't it? You know, that's part of our human nature, is that we worry. But I think the pandemic has blown that apart, and people who've never felt anxiety ordinarily have felt anxious. So yeah, I think it's a pandemic in itself really.
Indeed, and I think there's that feeling that, as you say, we all feel anxious at certain times, but there are degrees of it, aren't there? There are degrees of anxiety.
Absolutely, it's a spectrum, isn't it? So you might just be fretful and worry a bit, or you might be the other end of the spectrum where you are, you know, experience terror and everything in between. So it's hugely broad, but I think all of us have been touched by it at some point in our lives, and increasingly.
Indeed. Yeah. And I think for me, as a Christian, I think in some ways it's a little bit more complicated, isn't it? Because the Bible talks a lot about fear. And in fact, someone once said to me that it says 365 times a day, you know, once for every day of the year, that we are not to be afraid. And there are verses like the one in Philippians that says, do not be anxious about anything. So how would you say, as a Christian, you deal with that sort of, those Bible passages?
I think that what's really important to remember is that that God has said that because He knows we are weak, He knows we are dust, He knows that we're anxious, and that it's not helpful to say to somebody, you mustn't worry. The Bible says you mustn't worry. No, it's a sin to worry. Nobody needs the guilt loaded on top of their anxiety, and that is certainly not what God is doing. That's not what He's about. I think the reason He talks about it so much is that He understands that we live in a world that is full of uncertainty, and He is the only certain thing. So when He says, don't be anxious, He's saying, I am the person you can trust. I'm the one that has this in hand. And when you look away from me, you will be anxious, because there's a lot to be anxious about in the world, but actually God is over and above it and in control. So, you know, I think that's why He talks about it so frequently.
Practically speaking, what sort of things can you suggest, or what would you say to somebody who is really anxious?
I think there's no magic sort of antidote, but as a Christian, I think one of the things we can do is take God at His word. So find verses that help you to feel secure in who He is, and learn to trust His word over your own fear. So it might be still and know that I'm God, just that reminder of who He is. But also, I find it really helpful to remember that Jesus knows what fear feels like. He's experienced it, the worst kind. So He meets us in that place. He knows how it feels. He's not removed from it. And I found that really helpful, that He identified with me in those moments of fear. And also distraction is really helpful. Something to take your mind off its ruminating, that cycle. So for me, from a Christian perspective, that's normally listening to some worship music, something that literally lifts me and turns my eyes towards who God is and what He promises.
Rosie, thank you so much. It's been really good to talk to you about this.
Pleasure.